if you're in ministry and you are choosing what kind of ministry you're doing and how you're doing it, most likely the Lord's not behind it. Because when the Lord is behind something, it's going to be His will, it's going to be His way, and it's going to be His expression that He's created for you.
Podcast. I am your host, Philip Carroll, and I'm so excited to be with you for another Monday episode. Today's guest is, we had a great conversation. His name is Freddy Ramirez, and if you don't know him yet, you will find out very soon what he does and what he is all about. Today's episode is all about ministry. What does it look like to be new in the Lord? What does it look like to have the calling of God, but understand that you need to be processed? I think so often we go through these seasons in life where we feel like because of our anointing and because of what we feel called to do and who we're called to be around, we feel like we can rush our process and forget to build our foundation. So today's conversation with Freddy Ramirez is all about the beginning stages, how to maintain your ministry, and how to build your character and grow your foundation in the process. Look, you don't want to miss out on this conversation. So if you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and leave a thumbs up. If you're watching listening on Spotify, go ahead and leave a rating on this podcast. Give us a follow, and you're going to hear it again at the end of this episode. But feel free to look in the description and follow Freddy on the social media platforms that he has, as well as through his website. You can find all of that in the description. And without further ado, here is my conversation with guest Freddy Ramirez. And I've been trying to get you on for a little while. Yeah. I'm so excited to have you on, and just what you have to offer and what you have to say, I know is going to really bless the listeners and the watchers of this podcast, whether they tune in now or they tune in the future. So just before we get started, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself for those who don't know you?
Yes, my name is Freddy Ramirez, originally from the Dominican Republic. And how I got to where I'm at now, I never really intended to be part of the church world, never really liked ministry. Was always kind of those people was just like, oh, I believe in God, but, in my own separate way. But I had a experience at the age of 5 that kind of changed my life. There was a woman, long story short, who hated my mother, and she, living in the Dominican Republic, she went over to Haiti, which is a voodoo capital, and spent the whole weekend to release a curse over me, to send me over to Satan. What that ended up doing is opening my eyes to the spiritual world. And the Lord protected me from that curse. But I was exposed to the spiritual world since the age of 5. And I grew up seeing things in the spirit until I finally gave my I finally gave my life to the Lord at the age of 18. And had many encounters with angels. I've had a couple of encounters with Jesus, where he called me into the ministry. And so now, I lead a ministry called Spirit House. We have a online discipleship community, and we're also in the process of planting 2 churches, Spirit House Miami and also Spirit House San Diego.
What I really love about your ministry and just you as a person is it's so organic. I think we live in a society and it's not helped by social media that everything seems so almost filtered, right? Everything seems so professional and calculated and almost like it follows the same kind of formula. But with you, it feels so organic because it comes out of you, right? It's not you trying to fit yourself into a mold, but really you trying to be what the church should be and love the way that you should love and building yourself from that place. And a big part of why I wanted to have you on for this episode is really just this theme of organically starting small but growing according to what you can handle. And even as you said, starting from a place where this isn't necessarily what you wanted to do to the place where you are now, where you're planting on both corners of the country. being in Florida and in California. And it's so great to see because you're just doing what you're called to do, right? You're
Absolutely.
not trying to create yourself into this machine. You're not trying to build yourself into a formula, but you're just being who you are. And it's because
Yeah.
of an encounter that you almost stumbled into, not because of something you were seeking, but because of something that was done to your family. And it's just so amazing to see. So even as you encountered the Lord at the age of 18 and began to walk into that direction, how did you find yourself how did you find yourself as being called into a form of leadership? How did you know that you weren't going to just be another normal person or another person just loving the Lord, but how did you begin to build and become who you are today?
Well, you brought up a couple of good points that you said about, being organic and being who I am. And that's something that I wish I could say happened, right off the bat.
Yeah.
But it really did not. Because, I never really wanted to be part of the church. I have great friends who grew up in their church and they knew from birth they were called to be part of the church, and that wasn't necessarily the case for me. So I remember even when the Lord called me and ministered to me, I remember I even told the Lord one day, well, Lord, I love you. I will serve you in some sort of capacity, but just don't ever bring me into any sort of ministerial leadership. And so when the Lord disregarded that prayer and brought me into leadership, it took a while, for me to truly surrender. Just because I saw all of the, I want to say like all of the staples of what it meant to be a leader in ministry. I saw the state of the church and I saw a lot of things that I didn't necessarily want to be a part of. And the Lord really ministered to me there. But, to kind of, I guess, go back to your question is, um, even though there was a lot of reasons why I didn't want to serve, and a lot of people kind of get focused on that, like, oh, I don't go to church because everyone's a hypocrite. I don't serve in ministry because people are all about money. There's so many negative aspects of why people don't necessarily want to get involved in ministry, but we forget that at the end of the day, this is the Lord's. This is
Yeah.
God's bride. And so serving God doesn't necessarily mean that your reward comes from men, but it comes from Him directly. And so in that process, I had to learn to really focus on God and build my relationship with Him. And so as I started to pursue, and that's the interesting part, right? Like as I started to pursue my relationship with Him, He started to grow my passion for the church. And He started to grow my desire to serve the church. So it wasn't a desire for me personally to kind of come in and be like, okay, I'm going to do this. It's like, as I really began to seek God, He was the one that really started putting that in me. And so when I first came to the Lord, I just started to seek Him. I was just spending time with Him in prayer. I didn't know everything about prayer, but I just did it. I remember I used to put like, because I was brand new, right? And I didn't really know a lot of worship music. I just heard, if you want to pray, put some music on, turn all the lights off, go in a closed room, and then spend time with God. So like I would put Coldplay. Like I would put,
Fix You.
yeah. Oh, there was a list. There was a list of
Wow.
Coldplay songs that I would put, because I didn't know many worship songs. So one of the things that I recognized that today was like God wasn't looking for perfection. God
Yeah.
wasn't looking for like a mold of how you're going to seek me. All He wanted was to spend time with me. And, in that moment, as I continued to seek Him, He just started kind of anointing me to serve Him. And I just started coming across certain people. It just kind of happened. I want to say it like that. And I know that it sounds like like I'm saying, like it just happened on its own. But even though it felt that way, I know that it was God orchestrating all of these things so that I could begin to serve Him. And He gave me the love to serve people. It wasn't something that came directly from me. He gave me the love to serve people. And so as I started to seek Him, I started to kind of receive, these prophetic gifts and healing gifts and all these other gifts in order to serve people. And that's kind of how it just started.
I'm so grateful. I do want to address one thing you said. You made the statement that you didn't necessarily want to step into leadership and you prayed against it, but then the Lord kind of disregarded your prayer. And it's almost like we see nowadays, and I'm so grateful that I got saved when I did, because social media in terms of Christianity wasn't very big at the time.
Yeah.
Right. It's like you would post about it and people would just kind of ignore you and go about their day, especially when you're new and you don't know anyone who's also doing it. For me, the extent of internet activity when it came to ministry was, finding a church that uploaded their sermons on a podcast and listening to that on every Monday or every Thursday. But this idea that you could go and testify and find people who are doing things wasn't really a thing for me. And nowadays, you get saved and all of a sudden, here's a course you can take. Here's the book you should read. Yeah. Here's the conference you should attend. Here are the 45 church services you should watch every week, 3 times a week, depending on who's preaching. And this is all of these things that are prevalent today that, back then all you had was Bethel and IHOP and maybe Francis Chan was floating around your news feed. But it's like, for you, the authenticity comes in even the way you started to pray, right? You didn't have someone giving you a playlist or giving you an instrumental or telling you the prayer service to go to. But even in the way that you approached the Lord was such a, it had to be God if you were really going to feel something, because Absolutely. you're not being drawn into an atmosphere. You're not being drawn into someone else's anointing. But through that, as the Lord began to give you different anointings and different gifts and different direction in terms of your personal ministry, how did you start to realize that He favored you for encounter? You mentioned being, having an angelic encounter and really being set upon your place. Just even what I know of you outside of what you've said in this interview. But it's not too many people that we see that build themselves around encounter. So many people build themselves on what they know, who they are attached to, what they're called to do. But it's like your place of building comes from your encounter, not for your encounter. So how did you kind of find yourself understanding that that was your portion and that was going to be your direction when it comes to building your ministry?
Yeah. Oh man, that was even a process too. Because I even fought that. I first started kind of understanding that this was something that was happening to me, and this was something that kind of set me apart, because I remember that the first Christian service that I ever walked into, which was it's a whole story on its own, because I wasn't even supposed to be there. But I encountered the presence of the Lord. I wasn't encountered but I felt the presence of the Lord strongly, where I grew a hunger for more of His presence. I didn't know much about Him yet, but I knew that I wanted more. By the second time that I went there, the second service, I had a full-blown open vision and encounter where I saw a fireball in my hand after they were releasing a prophetic word about God using a new generation. He's releasing His fire. And I saw a fire in my hand. I remember I was closing my eyes, lifting my hands, because that's what the pastor said to do. I wasn't doing it because I felt spiritual, but someone came in and this prophet came in and said, I have this prophetic word for the young people. And they said, close your eyes and lift up your hands. So I just did it just to obey. And this fire appeared. When I closed my eyes, it's like my eyes open and I could see everything that I would see normally with my eyes closed. I'm sorry, with my eyes open, but I see a fireball in my hand. So I open my eyes and I'm shaking my hand up because I'm thinking someone put a fireball or someone like is lighting a fire in my hand, and I don't see it there. And so I keep on having experiences like this as I go to different services. And at first I'm thinking, oh wow, this is the place where everyone's having this. Like if I'm experiencing this, everyone else must also be experiencing this. Well, very quickly I found out that I was the only one experiencing that. So I started to understand, okay, this is something that is happening to me. Um, but the Lord used my experiences to grow very quickly. Within that ministry, I want to say within 6 months, I was a leader. I was mentoring about 100 people under me by that time. I was still a baby in the Lord, but I was being raised up as a leader simply because of the fruits that were coming from my encounters. And of course, it wasn't always an easy thing. And there was a moment of time where it caused, issues. And so I've kind of backed away from my encounters. I've met a lot of people who also say they have encounters, and I felt like they weren't really being honest. And so I kind of just started not liking having encounters anymore because of all the stuff that was coming around it. And then I just wanted to go into regular ministry. I wanted to now become a mold. I wanted to just do what everyone else was doing. I don't want to stand out. I don't want to talk about encounters. Just put me to pastor people. I just want to be a normal ministry guy. And eventually the Lord said, no, Freddie, I've called you to share, your encounters. And I argued with God because I was like, God, why is this beneficial? How is this going to benefit anybody? Why are you trying to make me a guy that's going to talk about spiritual experiences all this time? Like, that's just, to me, that sounded nuts. Like that didn't make any sense. But I learned through that experience that when you surrender yourself to God, you don't get to choose what kind of ministry you're in. If you're in ministry and you are choosing what kind of ministry you're doing and how you're doing it, most likely the Lord's not behind it. Because when the Lord is behind something, it's going to be His will, it's going to be His way, and it's going to be His expression that He's created for you. And so when I really began to really realize, I want to say, was like almost 4 years ago, even though I've been in ministry for a long time, and encounters have always bared a lot of fruit in my ministry, even when I've kind of had a time where I backed away from ministry. When the Lord told me, I want you to go out and I want you to start speaking to your encounters, then the fruit began to appear. Ministry began to grow. More people started getting touched. And today, I'm amazed because I used to argue with God, how is this going to benefit anybody? And I get emails literally every single day. People saying, man, I've been attacked by demons. I heard your story on this. I need help with this. I need prayer. I need counsel. I even have parents asking me about their kids. Like, hey, my kids are telling me about all of these experiences they're having. Could you help us? And so the Lord really surprised me. And I was surprised with how necessary this kind of ministry was. And that's kind of how I've learned, like, okay, this is what God has called me to do.
It's so necessary. Even that was about the time that I met you, when you first started to step into that. And I remember you gave me a word about writing books. And I'm like, I don't think I'll be that guy. And then it's a couple years later. And now I'm like, I have too many ideas and not enough time. So it's like, but so specifically that time, that would have been early 2021. And just seeing the needs, right? The way that the body has moved, because, 10 years ago, nobody was doing deliverance. Nobody was really publicly operating and healing. The body of Christ at the time was so heavily focused on all night prayer and praying and asking for revival. And then all of a sudden people show up that start doing these things that we were praying for, and they're all of a sudden, seemed as crazy or
Yeah.
rejected or
Yeah.
not as favored, or, if you're the deliverance guy, you're the deliverance guy and everybody wants to use just you because no one else is really stepping forward in that. But then you start, as you said, like you start to see hidden in the cracks, I've been demonized. I need help. I don't know who to talk to. Counseling won't work. Therapy won't work. So then you start to see that, you might have been rejected by the religious who don't feel like they need your help, but all of a sudden you've now opened yourself up to those who also feel rejected by the church and those who feel rejected by religion. And even the way you came up, the fact that you felt, the curse placed on you in the Dominican Republic, almost marking you as being delivered from the very thing that you would walk into. And even seeing the way you grow and the way that you handle yourself. Something I want to talk about, you talked about getting saved, and within 6 months you have over 100 mentees and you're leading in a way that you didn't necessarily ask for because of the fruit. I know firsthand, and I'm sure you can relate, and you kind of alluded to this mental fatigue, this emotional distress that comes with, being planted but not being able to process before you step into the early stages of what you're supposed to do. So it's like you got a taste of what you're supposed to do, but because you weren't processed yourself and you're being expected to be the catalyst to processing other people, what are some of the effects that had on you mentally, and even in your own, you talked about not wanting to do that level of ministry, but what are some of the things you did to not only process the fact that you were in that season, but how you kind of pulled yourself out of it practically, right? Not just the call of God, but what are some of the things you did for those who might be listening or watching that are in that season of debating whether or not they should really process or if they should take the next opportunity? What are some things that you would share with them, both in your process and any advice you would have for them?
That's such a good point. And, something that is very dangerous that many people don't talk about is the dangers of God using you very early when you start on. And that sounds very almost like contradicting. Like, why would it be dangerous for God to use you as you're just really coming into a relationship with Him? And this happens, I see this happen so many times where someone will come in and they'll catch what we call the new believer fire.
Yeah.
Like, it's just like,
oh, no, I know all about it.
Yeah, they're just unpassionate. They want to preach to everybody. They want to prophesy to everybody. They want to minister to everybody. And, you don't want to put it out. Especially if you're like mentoring this person, you don't want to put out that new believer fire, because that new believer fire is what's going to get them through their next season. But you do need to guide them properly. And it was something that I wish I had, because the Lord was definitely using me. And the Lord was using people that were under me. He was using everything He was doing. And the truth is, I had to, in the more recent years, kind of relearn everything that I was doing, because at that early stage, by 6 months of my salvation, coming into leadership, doing events, hosting discipleship groups, opening up different Bible studies, doing all of these different things, my success was coming because I was obeying the voice of God. But I didn't really understand what I was doing. So even though I was having success and I was having fruit, the only reason why that happened was purely the grace of God. So I remember there's been a couple of times where I even look back on my old notes, stuff that I used to teach back then. There were things that God was teaching me or telling me to teach. And I'm looking up at it years later, like 10 years, and I'm like, I had no understanding of what I was teaching. Like I could not understand anything. If you would have asked me back then, Freddie, explain to me how this works, I would have not been able to tell you. But I preached it good. I preached the house down, and people got saved, people got healed and got delivered. And so at those stages, there's no sense of danger, because God's using you. You're under His grace, which also means you're under His protection. But what needs to happen in that moment is there needs to be a development of character. And the mistake I think that fell upon I would say, to say bluntly like this, fell upon the leadership that I was under, was to really help me develop my character. They were
Yeah.
more interested in developing my gift than developing the character inside of me. And so at the very beginning, you may say, okay, well, I'm new and God's using me and everything's good. I'm living right. I'm living holy. I'm being used by God. Everything's working out well. That's wonderful and that's expected. But the dangers are in the long run. Years later, after God continues to use you and that grace begins to shift, because that grace that you have for that season, it's not going to be the same grace you have for another season. So once that grace for that season begins to shift, now your character is what's going to take you through.
Yeah.
And if your character has not been fully developed and has now come into a place of maturity, you are going to struggle. And that's what happened to me. I struggled because even though I was ministering, I really didn't know how to walk the walk. I knew how to prophesy, I knew how to heal the sick, but I didn't know how to maintain faithful in my relationship with God when I wasn't having encounters, or when I wasn't having visions, or when fruit wasn't happening, how to persevere during trials and tribulations. And so my advice, I would say, is that if you're new in ministry, if you're just starting off, whether you're in the place where you say like, hey, Freddie, like I am, like God is using me, like I am ministering to people, people are getting touched, and delivered, or you may be struggling with that. More importantly than developing your gift, develop your character, because whatever you develop, what you don't develop now, you will be forced to develop later on. And so for me, I almost kind of had to take a step back. And the Lord even put me into that place where he kind of pulled me back a little bit from ministry to put a strong foundation in me on him. And so that was beneficial for me because now, I would say our ministry, after, I kind of took a step back and started working behind the scenes, and the Lord relaunched our ministry almost 4 years ago. It's a whole different place now. But for anyone that is new, if you are being led by someone, however God may be using you to touch hundreds of thousands of people, but what you need to make sure that your leadership is actually mentoring you. It's developing your character. Because if they don't develop your character, that ministry gift that you're displaying will only last about a year or two. So if you want to last for the long run, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 plus years, you'll need to focus on really developing your own personal relationship with God, biblical principles, how to walk with God, how to walk in purity. All of those things are so important because if you don't have that, the enemy will take you out very quickly.
Yeah, wow. I think for me, you mentioned that new believer fire. I remember back when I first started doing this thing, I grew up in church, but it wasn't until I graduated high school that I received the Spirit and began to walk the walk, as you said. And I remember I'd be the one, the loud prayer. We'd be in a quietish, like we'd be in a field praying, right? And it'd be like everybody's kind of doing their thing, but we're done and I'm still going, and I remember I was at a church service once and they had to ask me to quiet down a little bit because they didn't do that there. And I remember leaving. I was like, y'all religious, y'all don't have any fire. And people used to tell me like, oh, I used to be zealous when I was young. And eventually this happened. And I remember I used to pray like, man, I hope that never happens to me or y'all old folk. And it's like this ignorance of like, you keep going, you're going to burn yourself out. But then there's a wisdom that comes with the character of knowing when to talk and knowing what to say. And you mentioned even that gift. I wouldn't say I feel more gifted than I did, but I definitely feel more wise. and even the stewardship of that gift, because you have the gift, but if you're going to abuse people with it, the Lord's not going to give you a grace to operate anymore. And he's
Absolutely.
going to take you out of those places. And even though you're gifted, you're going to be the person that nobody wants to be around,
Yeah, exactly.
because they'll find someone else who's just as gifted, who has good character, and all of a
Exactly.
sudden you're bitter, you don't have opportunity, and nobody wants to bring you anywhere, nobody wants to be around you.
I think
And
one
for
of
you,
the greatest examples of that, that I love this biblical example of Elisha and the sons of the prophets.
yeah.
The sons, that's such a great example for me, because if you read that story, there's a moment where right before Elijah's about to be taken up, the sons of the prophets, and me being raised in the school of the prophets, we always use that as an example to teach immaturity. And in that biblical example, you have the sons of the prophets who are telling Elisha, "Hey, Elisha, hey, don't you know that your master is about to be taken away from you?" So they're using their gift, and it's true, it's accurate. That information is correct, but it shows you that they did not have the maturity to know how to administrate that gift. And so that's why they were not anointed as the prophet Elisha was. Because even though Elisha said, "I know, shut up." So Elisha knew that information, but he knew, hey, this is not the moment to be doing this. This is not the appropriate moment to administrate that gift. And it's that character that got him to receive the double portion.
Even, another example, if Joseph was sold into slavery and 6 months later he was promoted into the place of running Egypt, he would have punished people, he would have lashed out at people, he wouldn't have had the wisdom to say what he said, right? It wasn't you who sold me here, but it was God leading me here to preserve a remnant,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
I think so often, we get saved and we even have an opportunity. I remember, man, I was teaching 6 months to a year into this thing, and I was saying stuff that the more seasoned Christians would be like, wow. But if you ask me to go deeper and tell you how I came with this revelation, I'd say, look, I just read it and that's what came to mind, right? That tells me this isn't my information. This isn't my personal, because 6 months ago I read this and I didn't know what was going on, right?
Wow.
And all of a sudden it almost feels like overnight I had the ability to read and understand, right? But then I had to have the character built within me to say, this isn't just me being awesome, but there's a purpose for this. And I think even when we talk about starting something, growing something, building ministry, there's a purpose, right? You're not just mentoring someone so that they could tell you how awesome you are, but you're mentoring them because that's what is chosen for you in this season,
Yeah.
right? So I just want to co-sign what you said, is just to understand and be grateful for the process, because 10 years from now, you're going to miss the season you're in now.
Yeah.
And you're going to consider it the good old days of, but even now you're just trying to get to the next season. But when you get there, if you don't allow yourself to process, you're not going to pick up the skills you need to grow past that season. And all of a sudden you're going to be seen as someone who is just bitter, is underdeveloped, is stuck in an old way of thinking.
And how many people do we know? I'm sure, Philip, you know so many as well. How many people do we know that when they first came in, man, you could see the call of God on their life. You can see their gifting. I mean, it was like, there's some people when they come in, they pick up gifts quicker than other people. They like start prophesying more accurately with less training. I've met people who within literally a month, they're prophesying accurately as people that have been in ministry for about 10 years. And there's so many people that I have known in my past that, man, you look at them, they're like, wow, the amazing call that is upon your life, the gifts that are on you, this person's going to be unstoppable. But because they didn't go through that process and they didn't have proper leadership, they didn't have proper training of their character, today they're completely gone from ministry. They want nothing to do with God. And so, and that's not what, there's so many people like that. So just because someone comes into the scene and they seem so anointed right off the bat, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to make it past a year.
You never want to be known for what you used to be, or what you used to do, right?
Yeah.
Even the Bible talks about those who finish the race, right? And I think so many people, even today, they cling to what they used to do, or who they used to be, or how big their following used to be. And it's like those were their peak. But for those who are maturing, for those who are pursuing character, it's not about what they used to do. It's about what can they do tomorrow? What is their future looking like? And because they're not clinging to old revelation. They're not, and even as you said, people will rise up, and it's like, man, like even those who are doing this, there's almost like the desire to be jealous. Like, where did they come from?
Yeah.
How are they doing this? What do they know that I don't? And you start to think, man, they must have been processed underground for years and years, and you don't even know that they just got saved last Tuesday.
Yeah.
It's just that they stepped into a special realm of revelation, but they're not cultivating, right? They're trying to act above their time put in,
Absolutely.
because while this isn't a meritocracy, the time you put in is very important.
Yes.
Because you're building a foundation, right? And if you don't build a foundation, once you lose what you have, because what many don't know is that as you do this, and I'm sure you've learned it more than well enough, there's going to be plenty of times where you feel like everything you've done has just been taken away from you. Absolutely. Everything you've built has been cut out, right? Your legs have been cut out from under you. But the advantage you have is you've put in the time to know that if you just wait a little longer, everything will come back.
Absolutely.
Right?
There's something,
you want to be Job. You don't want to be Job's friends.
Yes, absolutely. So there's a secret to ministry that I call the Abraham's test.
Okay.
That the Lord will take you through. And what the Abraham's test is, and every single one of us will go through this, is seasons in our lives where it will seem like everything the Lord has given you is being stripped away. And it seems like you're going to fail. It seems like, man, like nothing's really taking off. Like this is just kind of going downhill. But in that moment, the Lord's observing you. And the Lord's testing your heart to see, how are you going to react? Are you still going to bless me? Are you still going to worship me? And am I still the focus of your ministry? Or is now your ministry and your gifting the focus of your ministry? And when the Lord does that, that comes out to light very quickly. If all you really care about is your influence and your ministry and what you can do, then that's what's going to come out to light. And once the Lord takes you through those kinds of trials, you will react that way. But if you truly are for the Lord, then the Lord will double what you have. It's as he did with Abraham. So that's something that each and every single one of us will go through. So everything that God blesses us is great. It's amazing to serve the Lord. It's amazing to be in ministry. It's amazing to be able to impact so many people's lives. But we need to understand that our main priority needs to be Him. And we also need to keep our own relationship intact as well. Because even in ministry, and you know this as well, I've heard so many preachers who are itinerant. I'm itinerant as well. I'm here for a month before I begin traveling again. But there are so many preachers, and I hear this often so many times. They don't even have a relationship with God anymore. They don't have a prayer time anymore because they're so busy traveling. So, I mean, think about it. We have preachers who are ministering Jesus without Jesus.
Man.
That's dangerous.
Yeah. Right. You're going off of old revelation, and all of a sudden you lose your peace and you don't know what to do. And, you're so used to telling other people, and it becomes so routine. And to you, this is basic information. So you don't even go back to it because you think that you're living above it. So all of a sudden you need to find a new formula. And that's how people start to go crazy. And that's how people start to lose touch with what brought them there, right? And
Yeah.
it's like, it becomes so sad to see, because the last people that will find out are the ones who follow you and yourself, right?
Yes.
And by the time that you figure it out, it's too late, because
Yes.
you've become so accustomed to living aside from the grace of God.
Absolutely.
And that's what I want to leave you guys with. Those who are watching and tuning in, is just take your time, understand that there's a process and you need to learn to love your process. But just because you feel graduated from that place doesn't mean that you need to get away from it, because you always have to go back to that place of what you consider the basics. So as we conclude, do you I want to know, do you have any final words? And also, how can the people find you? How can people stay in touch with what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So my final words, if you're in a place where you're just really beginning in ministry, is really keep your foundation strong. Make sure your foundation is always strong, because, like Philip said, in every single season, there are going to be moments where you're going to go back to your foundation. And if your foundation is not strong, you will have nothing to go back to. And your ministry and every work of your hand will suffer because of it. So make sure that your principles, your own values, like in my ministry, I have certain values that me and my team all run by, but they're not just culture in my ministry. They're my values. Like I value one of my most important values is humility. I value humility above everything else. I don't care how powerful you are. I don't care how prophetic you are. I don't care how anointed you are. If you cannot be humble, I have an issue with that. So for me, those are values that keep my heart pure, to make sure that my relationship with God is strong. So make sure that you build foundations and values for yourself that are important and that are strong, so that in every single season, no matter what comes, you can always go back and depend on those things. And if you're interested in getting in contact with me and finding out more about my ministry, you can find us on my website at freddyramirez.com. That's FREDDY. Also on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/, Freddy Ramirez. And then there you can also find all my social medias, like Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook.
And look, if you're watching on YouTube, you're listening on Spotify, check the description. You'll find all of his links and anything else that he's doing. I'm sure you can keep up with him in those places. Freddie, thank you once again for coming on. I'm sure I'll have you on. Thank you, Freddie. I so enjoyed that conversation, and I'm looking forward to having you on again in the very near future. Look, guys, if you enjoyed that conversation, go ahead and leave a comment on this YouTube video, leave a comment on the Spotify, leave a thumbs up, leave a rating. Go ahead and follow him on all of his social media platforms. Again, you can find that in the description, whether you're on YouTube or Spotify. And with that being said, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Rendered Hope podcast. We'll be back with you for another Thursday episode this week. Look, we had one last week. We have one this week. And next Monday, we have another special guest. So I hope you guys have a great day. And again, thank you for listening to the Rendered Hope podcast.